Welcome to the Fierce Kind Mama of Multiples podcast. This podcast is for anyone raising multiples, twins, triplets, or more. I speak to inspiring parents of multiples who have healed from unexpected pregnancies and birthing experiences and who candidly share the highs and lows of raising multiples. I also speak to the professionals that work with multiple birth families. Together, we cover the practicalities of raising more than one baby at a time, as well as enhancing the emotional well-being of caregivers and children alike. Come join us as we laugh, cry, and share our personal and professional wisdom on all things multiples. I'm your host, Dr. Christina Kvetsa, and I am a fierce, kind mama of multiples. Welcome to today's show. Today I'm joined by Dr. Sophie Brock. Sophie is a motherhood studies sociologist and mother who offers education on the sociology of motherhood and how our broader society shapes our experience as mothers. Covering topics and concepts such as the perfect mother myth, the care-career conundrum, the anger-guilt trap, and more, Sophie's work contributes to changing the cultural construction of motherhood to create a world where mothers feel empowered, supported, and valued. Sophie's offerings include self-study courses for mothers, mentoring for mother-supporting professionals, her podcast, The Good Enough Mother, and the Motherhood Studies Practitioner Certification online training. You're going to hear Sophie and I talk about her expertise in motherhood studies, why motherhood studies is an important area worth exploring. We do spend some time talking about the institution of motherhood, what that means, and the implications for us as mothers. And we also focus on the findings of her PhD research, which I think will be particularly relevant to many multiple birth families, where Sophie focused on the experiences of mothers with children with disabilities and additional needs. So I really hope you enjoy this conversation with Sophie. And before we get to the interview, I just want to remind you of my free resource for those of you who are expecting multiples. This is a guide to help you prepare physically, emotionally, and financially. And you can find it at my website, fiercekindmama.com. I'll pop the link into the show notes for you too. Welcome, Dr. Sophie. Lovely to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this chat.
Yes, so we would have mentioned in the bio that you're a sociologist and your expertise is in motherhood studies. Can you please share with us what motherhood studies is and why is it an area of study worth exploring?
Yeah, well, motherhood studies is an interesting discipline because I'm sitting in the space of sociology, and motherhood studies is interdisciplinary and also multi-theoretical. So it means that it draws from a diverse area of areas of interest and research and scholarship and disciplines. So I'm in the strand of sociology. The person who coined motherhood studies was Professor Andrea O'Reilly in around 2006 to 2008. And it's an interesting area of study in that it was named kind of decades after work within the discipline even began. So part of what Professor O'Reilly's intention was in even naming motherhood studies as a field was an act of kind of resistance in and of itself to name a place for maternal scholarship, because part of what is a consequence of a couple of things, one being that it's multidisciplinary. So when you have all of these different disciplines and you have a specialty area in maternal scholarship and research, it can be hard to find the spaces and the conferences and the opportunities to speak to other people who have a focus on the maternal, but who are from a completely different discipline. And the other part of it was being able to name it as a discipline, as an act of resistance, because so often focus and research on mothering and motherhood is marginalized within our different areas of study and within academia more broadly. So it came about as a response to that. And then Professor O'Reilly has founded Demeter Press, a press dedicated to focus on mothering, and also Journal of the Motherhood Initiative. And there are other organizations that have kind of grown in the last decade or so to help connect maternal scholars and people who are working in this area in academia, but then also outside of it as well, in spaces of activism. So that's like a little bit of a synopsis or a summary of what motherhood studies is.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that explanation. And one question that came to my mind when you were speaking, and I'm wondering if some listeners will have this question is, I think some people can make the argument we should be looking at fathers' experiences as well. Like we're not being inclusive when we talk about motherhood studies. So why do you think it's important to focus on the experiences of mothers specifically?
Well, I would argue that a response to talking about motherhood studies, a response of being we need to talk about fathers, is a very example of the patriarchal conditioning that we are living within. Because whenever we have space to talk about women's experiences, to be asked a question of what about men's experiences, it's a decentering of mothers. And that's part of what we need to fight against. We absolutely need to talk about fathers' experiences. There's an area of study called fatherhood studies. There's areas of study that is dedicated to exploring masculinities, hegemonic masculinities. Absolutely, we need to look at parenting as a concept. But if we invisibilize the work of mothers and invisibilize the data that shows the majority of people who are caregivers are mothers, and the majority of people who are holding the responsibility for the emotional mental load and the invisible labor that's involved in unpaid care work that keeps our GDP running in the way that it does, if we invisibilize all of that by using the terms parents, then we're actually contributing to some of the very things we're trying to deconstruct. So that's part of why I believe it's important to be able to name the work of mothers and motherhood studies. Other people would disagree, though, and would use different language.
Yeah, right. Can you speak a bit more about that? What would other people, what is the argument to use different language or to not use, the language that we're talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, probably I'm not the best person to encapsulate that argument because I disagree with it. But I
Yeah.
guess the argument would be a sense of we need to degender our language in order to promote equality. And so part of what I think is important here is to first name the differences between gender and sex. And when we're talking about the experience of being a mother, we're talking about something that is both a sexed experience and a gendered experience. And when we're talking about breaking down patriarchal motherhood and all of the shoulds that come along with what it means to be a mother, we're actually talking about breaking down the gendered aspect of it. So that's the idea of this is what it is to be a woman. This is what it is to be a mother, and a whole bunch of constraints and constrictions that come with that. So that if you fall outside of that, you're not seen to be good. You're not seen to be as able to adhere to that label of what it means to be the good mother. And so part of what we're doing in this space is actually pulling that apart. But it's also really important to recognize that it's a sexed experience. And a lot of the time, not always, it involves experiences of the body as well. And so, some people may argue that talking about experiences in that way contributes to the division between the sexes. And I suppose we need to talk about parenting in order to promote equality within parenting. But I mean, that's a completely different space to the area that I work in.
Yeah. And I think it's important, maybe we deconstruct a little bit because we've talked a bit, or, you've mentioned a couple of times patriarchal motherhood. And I think for some of the listeners on this podcast, they might not be familiar with that term. So I'd love for you to speak a little bit more about what we mean by that.
Yeah, so patriarchal motherhood can also be used in the language of the social construction of motherhood. Or I talk about it as the tank, and I can explain the fish tank analogy if you want, Christina, but it is a way of referring to how the system of motherhood socially, culturally, and institutionally exists. So it was first articulated by Adrienne Rich in her book of Woman Born. This was in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And part of the distinction that Rich made and that others have built upon since is the distinction between motherhood as an institution and mothering as an experience. And so the way that I've encapsulated that as part of my work is for us to be able to name and understand the implications of theoretical concepts on our everyday lived experience. Because it's all well and good for us to say, well, patriarchal motherhood exists and there's a whole bunch of research to support that, and we live within a patriarchal society, and these are all of the ways that it can make our lives harder. But well, how does that actually happen? How can we make that a little bit more tangible to see the impact of social systems and structures and ideologies on our everyday lives? And part of that was through I created this fish tank analogy to ask us to imagine that we have this round glass fish tank, and that is representative of our society. And generally, we don't know we're within the tank, right? Until we put language to it and name it, we think this is just the way things are. anything that is being seen as normalized, or that's just what it means to be a mother, that's what we need to problematize if we're looking at it from a sociological perspective and if we want to make visible patriarchal motherhood. So this tank that we're living within, whether fish inside, mothers specifically, or it could also be anyone else, actually, everyone is living within the tank. But for the purposes of this conversation, mothers are inside the tank and we're born into the tank. It's not as if we just jump in there when we become mothers. And so what we're doing is we're swimming around in this water that fills up the tank, and the water represents our culture. And so the structure of the tank is made up by our institutions as well. So we're talking about here the medical system, the maternity system, the family as a system, actually, as well. We're also talking about the health system, the schooling system, our political system, and also our economy. And that impacts our culture. Our culture also impacts systems. So it's dynamic. But part of what culture is referring to, which is the water that we're swimming within, that comes from our relationships, the conversations that we overhear, cultural scripts, things that are said to us when we become mothers, for example. Also, media, marketing, advertising, social media, absolutely now, pop culture. And what happens is that we are socialized, which means we are swimming around within that tank and we're absorbing messages about what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a mother for all of our lives in one way or another. And what patriarchal motherhood refers to is the way that that structure of the tank flavors the water in a particular way, so that not only have we breathed in and absorbed particular norms around what it means to be a mother, but our experience is also structured by those norms. So how we go about what it means to be a mother and how we live our lives, it's too simple to say that it has to do with personal choice. We need to look at our socialization, and then we also need to look at the world that we're living within and social policy, and the structuring of our work, right? Paid work and maternity leave, and all of these things hugely shape what our experiences are going to be as individuals. So patriarchal motherhood is, it's a complex term, obviously more than I can go into in the context of this podcast, but in a simplified way, it's talking about the tank, the way that the outside world sets up an idealized image of what it means to be a mother and has particular rules that come to shape our experience and our belief systems.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That explanation. Thank you for deconstructing that for us and explaining that. I just want to talk a little bit about your PhD research because I know that it was focused on mothers with children with disabilities. And the majority, as you already know, the majority, if not all, of my listeners are or will be parents of twins, triplets, or more, who sadly are more likely to experience giving birth to children who have disabilities or illnesses or develop them. So we know that the rates of certain physical and mental health conditions are higher, sadly, in multiple births. So I was wondering if you could help us understand what your research revealed in terms of the lived experiences of mothers who were caring for children with disabilities.
Yeah, so in terms of going back to that tank analogy that I just described, part of how that relates to being able to respond to your question is understanding that we live within a social and cultural environment that pedestals and idealizes and writes the script of what it means to be a mother. And part of that comes out through the concept of the perfect mother myth. It's called also a bunch of other things, or the good mother concept. And part of what that involves as kind of prescriptive things that is baked into our image socially and culturally, and then often into our belief systems, is that the perfect mother is, well, for a start, she's usually painted as white, middle class, heterosexual, financially stable, and is in a monogamous relationship, more likely married, and she chooses to become a mother. She's within a particular age range and she gives birth effortlessly and falls in love with her baby. And part of the painted picture of the perfect mother myth, which is extensive, is that she has a child who isn't disabled, who doesn't have disabilities, who doesn't have additional needs. That's not set up as being part of the narrative that we come to expect, or that is even given much platform for visibility or a discussion in our society. And so part of what my research investigated with the mothers who participated was actually centering their experience first and foremost, because too often we actually look at mothers and we say, what about everyone else, right? As the question goes back to what about fathers? We go, what about everyone else? Well, no, we need space to actually say, what about mothers? What is their experience as individual and holistic people who are worthy and valuable of interest and scholarly inquiry in and of themselves? And part of what my research looked at were three strands: their experience of motherhood, so of the tank, their experience of their relationships, and their experience of their sense of self and identity. And so, in a summarized way, and without being able to go into all of the findings of that, part of what I found was that mothers who have children with disabilities face intensified pressure, scrutiny, judgments when it comes to self-sacrifice in motherhood. And that's complicated because oftentimes they're put in positions where they're the primary carer for their children and they are advocates for their children. And so in many circumstances one participant described needing to be a voice for her child. And so this obviously differs as well according to the disability that a child has, as well as their age. But one part of the research found that actually there was a lot more pressure on these mothers and a lot less space for them to be able to talk about their experiences honestly, with things such as maternal ambivalence or feeling multiple ways at once, or sometimes actually really struggling and finding it really hard to find spaces to voice that, where it wasn't dismissed and you aren't just given the label, oh, well, you're a super mum. I don't know how you do it. You're amazing. And when people offer social scripts like that, it's generally coming from a well-intentioned place. But what a lot of participants in my research told me was that comments like that actually felt very othering and made them feel very isolated and alone. And so this platforming and pedestaling of the mother as a self-sacrificial martyr was actually very toxic in a number of ways and very marginalizing, and served to be very stigmatizing for that mother and her family. Related to that, their experiences of fitting in or not with normality, and I'm using that in inverted commas. So there was a lot of discourse around what is seen to be normal. And so that connects with grief and a lot of other things. But one mother spoke to me and said, you grieve the child that you thought that you would have, and then you grieve for the child that you have. And it's not as complicated. It's not as simple as saying that you wish that you could take away your child's disability because you don't want them to experience pain or stigma, because in many ways, the mothers that I spoke to, at least in this research, and everyone has different experiences of this, but a big theme that came through was that the lessons that they have learned through their mothering experiences and through caring for their child, and that their child has taught them, were at the core and at the fundamental level of getting to know ourselves and our humanity, and that they wouldn't trade that for anything. And it prompted them to live their lives in a different way and have a different perspective on the meaning of life and purpose, and bigger kind of existential questions around identity. But it's also, we have to be really careful not to valorize the experience and say, well, because this happened, I now appreciate life. So it's being able to hold actually nuance and complexity, and having spaces to talk honestly about their experiences. And connected to that was grappling with sense of self and identity. With the term normal that I just mentioned, we in the data analysis, participants both situated their experiences within frameworks of normality and contested frameworks of normality. So on the one hand, you've got to try and find ways to fit in. You've got to try and find places for belonging in your community and in your relationships and in society, because so often you are othered. And so it's with great intentionality and sometimes a lot of fight and struggle and advocacy to carve out those spaces and find places where you can quote unquote fit in and quote unquote be part of what is normal. Even sometimes with rituals such as birthday parties was one example one participant offered. At the same time, the same participants would rebel against normality and say, actually, I don't want normal. And that's not what we have here, and I wouldn't sign up for that. So again, being able to actually wrestle with two competing things seemingly opposite at once, and that is relevant to identity and how they experience that. And so this is the last point that I'll make, Christina, because, obviously there's a lot that could be spoken about here, but in terms of how participants reflected on or spoke about their sense of self and identity really, really varied across participants. And some would very much talk about themselves as being mothers first and foremost. And that was all encompassing of who they are. And that felt like for some, it was framed as a very empowering way to think about their sense of self. For others, it felt as though they had experienced an invisibilizing of themselves. So one spoke about the ways she's referred to as, say her child's name, which she isn't, is Jane. It's like, you are Jane's mother. So my name and identity has been erased because I'm referred to as her mother. And that came with a lot of pain and grief and related to relationships as well. And other participants, particularly those who were able to maintain engagement in paid work, because for many, they couldn't for various reasons. But for those who were able to, that served as a really important marker of sense of self and identity outside of the mothering role. And so I spoke about that, and the literature talks about that as subject positions. And, another way is different hats. You put on your work hat, you put on the friend hat, you put on the wife hat, you put on the mother hat. And so they spoke about it in that way, that of course there's juggling and tension there as well. So that's a little bit of a synopsis of some of the things, Christina, that came out of the research.
Hi there, Fierce Kind Mama. Sorry to interrupt the discussion, but I have something to share with you that I know you're going to love. We're often told that parenting can be hard, and whether you're a soon-to-be or current parent of multiples, there is going to come a time when you will probably feel stressed, overwhelmed, or even worried about the future. That's why I've developed a free guide for parents just like you with my 5 top tips for handling stress and overwhelm. You can download it now from my website, fiercekindmama.com. Yeah, wow. Thank you, Sophie. I can see how much richness there was in your research, and we could probably spend a podcast just on, one aspect that you've touched on. So thank you for summarizing that for us. One thing that you mentioned, that powerful statement about grief that the participant said to you that came out of your research, I was thinking, I think almost when I think about the experience of mothers of multiples, I often hear mothers of multiples talking about this grieving process, like grieving the loss of an imagined relationship that they would have with one baby. So when they find out they're having twins or triplets or more, there's this grieving process that happens straight away, and you feel kind of othered because most of the people around you, not all maybe, but most of the people around you don't have multiples. And then if you end up having children with disabilities, or one of your multiples has a disability, then it's almost like this double whammy, if you like, of feeling like, and I've had people on my podcast before speak about this, that they're mothers of multiples with additional needs, and they really thought they had to find their tribe because they found it really hard to connect with even the mothers of multiples who didn't have children with disabilities or with additional needs. So I think that's a really important point that you've raised there about that grief that can come from not having this idealized version of what I guess we're supposed to have when we become mothers. Also, one thing, one of the concepts, that I've spoken about in this podcast before is independence versus interdependence, and how our culture seems to stress the importance of raising independent children, children who can settle themselves to sleep, for example, and eventually have complete autonomy. And in an earlier episode, I challenged that notion. And I know from one of the outcomes from your dissertation, as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that you looked at individualization theory and its inappropriateness for women who care for children with disabilities. Can you expand on this and explain this to listeners? First of all, I guess, what do we mean by individualization theory and why it doesn't fit well for this cohort of mothers?
Yeah, I mean, I think that individualization theory doesn't fit well for any of us, not just mothers who have children with disabilities. And so part of what individualization refers to as a theory is it is one of the isms like globalization or neoliberalism, even looking at capitalism as a social force and the ways in which it operates as an ideology and plays out on individual lives. And it's in a simplistic way. I mean, you kind of encapsulated some examples of it there. Individualism really prioritizes and celebrates the lone hero, the individual who climbs the mountain with grit and determination, and they do it on their own. And they reach the top and they're triumphant and they're celebrated for doing so. And there's this myth that essentially we're able to achieve levels of what is deemed socially as success through sheer determination and will. And that is part of what lies at the foundation of many of our Western kind of capitalist systems and has been critiqued by lots of people who have more expertise specializing in that area. But part of what individualism can look like and the way that it can impact mothers so detrimentally, and even more so for mothers of children who have disabilities, is that two things amongst probably many. One is that it doesn't tell the truth. It's, no one is completely self-made. No one makes it to the top of the mountain on their own. And so it isn't actually painting a picture of realities, and it invisibilizes socioeconomics. It invisibilizes often trauma, and it invisibilizes the realities of the context that people face when it comes to marginalization and privilege. And the other thing that it does is that it not only invisibilizes all of those things and platforms a celebration of what we can actually break down as being a pretty toxic narrative, this sense that we're the lone wolf who gets it, right? Because we're social creatures, we're social beings, and we need each other. And part of that interdependence comes not only through the fact of our humanity and how we operate as human beings, but it also comes from being able to grapple with and acknowledge our vulnerability. Because part of what interdependence recognizes is that we need each other, and having needs can be a vulnerable place to be. And all of us started as infants who had needs and were very vulnerable. And if we're lucky enough to get there to old age, where a lot of the times we will have a need to be cared for in some way through death as well, and also through disability and through illness. And there's a theorist who I can't think of their name, but she talks about us being all temporarily able-bodied or temporarily not disabled, right? In a sense, we need each other, and not just when it comes to disability and vulnerability, but in terms of relationship and connection as well. And so for mothers who have children with disabilities, a really big theme that came out from the research, and something that's really prominent for many, again, depending on what disability their children have, is the sense that there's this language in motherhood that you get 18 summers with your kids, or you've got to get them to school and then to graduation and teaching them how to drive a car. And there are these milestones that are embedded into our cultural language of this is what you get to certain endpoints. And it's very painful, and you feel completely invisibilized in your experience of mothering when your experience doesn't fit that story. And not only that, but it's not about raising your child until 18 and then you see them fly off and you're an empty nester. It's grappling with fears around a sense that you can't die, because who will look after your child then? So massive things that mothers who have children with additional needs and disabilities are living with every day that so often is not recognized by others. And so, as you mentioned, with the experience of needing to go and find a community, that's exactly right. You need to connect in with other people who get it, who understand, and who can support you to grapple with some of those huge challenges that you are facing as an individual who has caring responsibilities that is not adequately supported, respected, or valued, but you're doing so within a hyper individualistic society. And so when everybody celebrates the independence of our children and see that as a marker of our status as good mother, where does that leave mothers whose children won't be able to fit that narrative and who are not striving for the same set of cultural mandates that we're surrounded with?
Yeah, that's really powerful. And I think, we've talked a little bit about, or you've mentioned a couple of times that phrase, the good mother, and that concept. And I know, I don't want to end this conversation without highlighting the fact that you are the host of the brilliant podcast called The Good Enough Mother. And the good enough mother as a concept or theory, as we know, was coined, as some of people listening might know as well, that it was coined by Donald Winnicott, a pediatrician and psychoanalyst. But can you tell us about the importance of that concept and the implications for modern motherhood and parenting?
Yeah, so the good enough mother's an interesting one because I'd be curious as to how listeners react when they first hear that term, because I think it can often be misinterpreted because it can sound as though it's a settling. So a sense of, oh, you want me to be just a good enough mother? That might be okay for other people, but I will not settle for just. And so there can be this sense of that it is a giving in, or it's a complacency, or it's a sense of, well, if I can't be perfect, I guess I'll settle for good enough. And what Donald Winnicott and others in the space have been able to explore, and when we draw on their work, part of what we're saying is a couple of things. One, just making it really clear that there is no perfect mother, and that the ideals that we have and hold up as being celebrated in our society are always incomplete pictures and sometimes projections and deliberately manufactured, it would depending on where we look. And so there is no mother that meets all of those idealized traits that are revered. So it's a recognition and a kind of a shattering of that myth that can haunt so many mothers. But it's also looking at drawing on child development as well as looking at development of maternal identity as well. So Rosika Parker talks about maternal ambivalence and actually grappling with a grappling with the reality of our humanity, which means that we're going to be quote unquote flawed in some way. There are going to be rupture and repairs that happen with our children. There are going to be ways that we feel as though we've failed them or that we're not enough. That is actually really beneficial for us and for our children. And you could probably talk about this more than I can, Christina, in terms of the kind of psychological development of children. But part of it is actually really important for them to have experiences of being mothered in a good enough way, which means being able to experience tolerable failures on behalf of our mothers, because that's an important opportunity that opens for differentiation and development of sense of self of the child independent of their primary caregiver or their mother. And so being able to experience some of that is really important in terms of identity development for children. It's also really important in terms of identity development for mothers. And so the way that I would talk about the good enough mother in, I suppose, a simplistic way that hopefully people can take away with them is that looking at and examining the shoulds that you've internalized around what it means to be the good mum, writing them out, making them really visible, and actively interrogating them to ask, where did each come from? Are they part of your values, or have they been handed down to you, either by your family of origin or by your culture? Probably both. And what are you wanting to keep as part of your values, and what would you be willing to release? And the next part of that is actually allowing ourselves to change our mind too. And sometimes we need a little bit more information before we can make decisions about what is important to us and that we value as part of our mothering. But when we go through that process of breaking down our internalized idealized mum or our internalized perfect mother myth that we've absorbed from swimming around in that water, what it opens way to is the good enough. And another way we can phrase it is motherhood defined on my terms that acknowledges the reality of my humanness. And knowing that it is a gift to our children to break down illusions of perfection, because that's exactly what they're going to grapple with in their own life too. And so that is ultimately what I am trying to get at when talking about good enough mothering as a concept, is to talk about being truthful about the reality of our humanity, and that's a gift, not a settle in.
Yeah, that's amazing, really powerful. And I think, when you were speaking, I was thinking a lot about the program that, I developed for mothers of multiples, where I speak a lot about values. I do that a lot with, and a lot of the work that I do, both on my online programs, but even in my therapeutic space around, what's important to us, what matters to us, and where does that come from, and kind of disentangling a bit of that, as you said, some of those social scripts that we might have picked up along the way. And the other thing that I was thinking about that I've talked about on this podcast before is around the judgments that we might face as mothers specifically, but this idea that, we good mothers raise good children and bad children are raised by bad mothers. And the sense that we might have of that, that comes just from our experience of being in the world, being a human, and the messages that we would have received around that. Do you have any final tips for mothers of multiples, maybe specifically around some of this stuff that we've just spoken about?
I think where what can be really useful is I'm thinking about just one piece of research that looked at experiences of guilt for mothers who have multiple children, not mothers of multiple, but mothers who have more than one child, and looking at uh, in some research anyways, the more children they had, actually the less guilt that they felt, because there was a reconciling with the reality that they were not going to be able to meet all of their children's needs when they have five of them there in front of them, right? So part of what I think where my mind goes to in response to that question is acknowledging that the breaking down of those idealizations and the getting really clear on what our values are and what our context is. So what choices are we supported and able to make in this current season of our mothering experience? And when we are able to do that, it's not only freeing for us, but it's also freeing for our children. And I'm sure all of us, well, I won't say I'm sure all of us, I have definitely experienced this, and most people that I've speak to have experienced this, in when you're mothering in public and your child is having a tantrum, or you have an older child and they swear, or they say something really rude to you or somebody else, or you've got a toddler and they rip their clothes off and they're screaming, wriggling around on the floor, and you can't pick them up and they're slipping out of your arms. And you have experiences in public where there can be a heightened sense of judgment that I'm supposed to be the parent here who is supposed to be able to know how to deal with this, who is supposed to have control over their child. And my child being labeled in this particular way reflects back on who I am as a parent. And a lot of that response is around shame, right? And a sense of I am insert whatever we want there, in terms of self-judgment. And so being able to grapple with and come into connection with our values, and then to be able to do the same sort of deconstruction around our children and what is expected of them, not just by us potentially, but also by others. There is an extent to which I think we need to build tolerance for discomfort with ourselves and in being in public situations. And I wonder, I don't know this, but I wonder if that's a case for mothers who have multiples, with a sense of sometimes just being literally outnumbered and having a sense of surrender to that, and acknowledgement that actually it is what it is. And there needs to be some level of disconnect between what other people may perceive and what we internalize that to mean, and what we may make it mean about ourselves and our mothering. So connection with values, interrogation of judgments from others and from ourselves, and being with the gifts actually that your children and your experience of mothering can offer to you.
Oh, that's amazing, Sophie. Thank you so much for those final thoughts and words of wisdom, really. It's been such a pleasure connecting with you. Where can people find out more about you and your work?
Yeah, thank you for having me, Christina, and for your really thoughtful and interesting questions. So you can find me at my website, drsophiebrock.com. It's all pretty repetitive. Instagram, Dr. Sophie Brock, Facebook, the same. And you've already mentioned my podcast, The Good Enough Mother. I have really interesting conversations on there to do with a whole diverse range of topics related to this. I have some free training and resources on my webpage, and the majority of the work that I do now is in supporting practitioners who work in mother care. I have some self-study courses for mothers who might be interested in that as well, but my main program is the Motherhood Studies certification that practitioners can come in and take to get a full complete training in the sociology of motherhood and motherhood studies. So that's where you can find me.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Sophie. We'll definitely put those details in the podcast show notes. Thank you again. It's been lovely connecting with you today.
You too. Thanks, Christina.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you like what you've heard, then please follow and leave a review so that other expectant and current parents of multiples like yourself can find this podcast and the valuable information it contains. I'd be so very grateful if you left a review and shared this with anyone you think could benefit from listening. If you have a particular topic you'd like me to cover on this podcast, feel free to reach out to me via my website, fiercekindmama.com. New episodes are released every second Wednesday, so I'll see you back here real soon. Any advice and information in this podcast is general only and has been prepared without taking into account your particular circumstances and needs. For tailored, individualized advice, please consult with a qualified professional.